The early morning sun was just peeking over the horizon when the giant turtle emerged from his cozy shell near the taxi depot, stretching his thick green legs as if he'd spent centuries in hibernation. He blinked slowly in the dawn light, his eyes warm and patient. The city was already stirring with activity. Buses roared, bicycle bells chimed, and pedestrians hurried along sidewalks, coffee cups teetering precariously in their hands. Yet amidst the hustle and bustle, the turtle's pace remained steadfastly deliberate. He was proud of his work as a taxi driver. Indeed, he was the only shelled chauffeur in town, and he took that distinction with solemn dignity. Over the course of 2 years, he had earned a reputation for being the slowest but most reliable transport in the entire metropolis. While others might have questioned his sense of urgency, or apparent lack thereof, he prided himself on never missing a passenger's requested pickup time. Somehow, he managed to run precisely on schedule, no matter how improbable that seemed for a creature with the speed of a garden snail after a heavy rain. His name was Terence T. Tuttleton, and everyone simply called him Terry. He was enormous even by dreamlike standards. His shell reached nearly 5 feet in height, painted with bright orange squares on the sides and a prominently displayed taxi sign crowned on the top. How he managed to mount a roof sign on his shell was a story in itself, involving a small stepladder, a willing pigeon, and a lot of double-sided tape. Terry's shell had been lovingly refurbished with a custom harness that let him wear a meter on one side and a little digital sign that read, "Available" on the other. With a swish of his stubby turtle tail, he turned that sign from off-duty to on-duty, letting the city know that the slow and steady taxi was open for business. Terry didn't have an engine. Instead, he moved with his own 4 feet, each step about as quick as a daydream. When people asked him how he could possibly keep to a schedule in a city that expected everything to be delivered yesterday, Terry would smile and say, "Time's funny, isn't it? It goes so fast for some folks and so slow for others. I'm bigger than a normal turtle, so maybe my concept of time is just a little different." Nobody could quite figure out how he managed it. But to them, it was enough to know that if they called for Terry's taxi, he would arrive right when they needed him, and he'd get them to their destination precisely when they wanted to be there. Sure, it wasn't as speedy as the bullet trains or the zippy mountain bikes that some folks preferred, but in Terry's taxi, you had time to gaze at the passing clouds and consider life's little mysteries, all while sitting comfortably on his shell. Of course, not everyone was patient enough for Terry's brand of transportation. Some folks looked at his listing in the directory, "Slow and Steady Taxi, the Tortoise Transport," and laughed. Others, in moments of desperation, hopped aboard only to regret it when they realized they'd committed to a glacial tempo. But even those ambitious souls often came around. Once you let the slow pace work its magic, you discovered it was actually kind of pleasant. Like a sudden oasis of tranquility smack in the middle of a crazy, fast-pacing modern existence, and Terry, with his wise turtle grin, made for surprisingly charming company. He regaled passengers with stories from his youth, which spanned decades. He spoke of the time he mistakenly entered a marathon and stunned the organizers by finishing last, 2 days late, yet somehow still received a applause-laced standing ovation at the finish line. That morning, Terry began his day by slowly craning his neck in the direction of the nearest street corner to let folks know he was ready. Sure enough, a small cluster of people wearing hastily thrown-on jackets and hurried expressions stood waiting at the curb. Most of them were looking for motorized cabs, but one woman, Miss Felicia Quimby, raised her hand sheepishly. She'd heard about Terry from a friend who raved about the life-changing experience of traveling at a snail's pace across the city. Felicia was an overworked accountant, prone to near panic attacks whenever her phone buzzed. She had scheduled the day off to deal with her nerves and decided, on a whim, that a slow ride might be exactly what she needed. Without a second thought, she stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said gently, feeling a little awkward about addressing a taxi driver who was also, quite literally, a gargantuan reptile. "Are you available to take me to Pinewood Park? It's about 15 blocks away." Terry nodded with what could only be described as genteel courtesy. His wrinkled green face creased into the semblance of a grandfatherly smile. "Climb aboard," he rumbled, arching his shells so that the woman could grip the well-placed handrail and clamber onto the cushioned seat near the apex. The seat was surprisingly comfortable, thanks to a plush arrangement of foam sponges and crocheted doilies. Once she was settled, Terry reached around to toggle the meter. A faint beep indicated that the ride had begun. The onlookers gaped at the spectacle of a giant turtle ambling forward while carrying a passenger on his shell. At times, it was hard to tell if the taxi was moving at all. But inch by inch, block by block, Terry commenced his morning's first journey. Felicia gave a small squeak of worry. I might need to be there by noon." It was already 7:30 in the morning, and she feared that might not be enough time. But she'd committed to this, so she took a calming breath, adjusted her hair, and reached into her purse for a small novel she'd been meaning to read. Terry chuckled softly. "No problem," he assured her. "I always get where I'm going right on the dot." It was such a ludicrous claim that she merely smiled. After a few moments of swaying gently on Terry's shell, however, Felicia felt her shoulders loosen. For once, she wasn't cramming into a subway car like a sardine, or cursing at traffic from behind a steering wheel. She was drifting. The city's noise receded, replaced by the soft clop of Terry's claws against the pavement and the occasional squeak of the meter's slow churn. She even heard birds singing in a nearby tree, a sound she rarely noticed before. Time felt slower, longer, and unexpectedly friendlier. About 3 blocks in, they came upon a frantic man in a business suit who was flailing his arms for a taxi. Felicia expected Terry to wave or move on, but the turtle quietly lumbered over to the curb. The man, whose name was Bernard, didn't even realize at first that the oncoming vehicle was a creature. When he finally noticed the shell-based taxi rolling to a stop in front of him, his eyebrows nearly left his forehead. "What in the world? I don't think this is going to be quick enough for me," he said, glancing at his phone. He was already late for a client meeting at the Daffodil Tower. Felicia calmly peered down from her vantage point. "Oh, I don't know," she said, surprising herself with a new sense of assurance. "It works out somehow. Don't ask me why, but it does." She gave a small wave of encouragement. Bernard, in desperation, took a leap of faith. He clambered onto the second seat, perched farther back on Terry's broad shell. There was just enough room for 2 passengers if they sat close together. The shell's surface was sturdy and large, reminiscent of a small dance floor, which a few daring souls had used for impromptu parties in the past. That was another story Terry occasionally told. Now carrying 2 passengers, Terry picked up the pace, or at least it seemed that way. The city's tall buildings passed by in a lazy parade. The turtle calmly negotiated intersections, giving right-of-way to every other living thing, including wandering pigeons that pecked at breadcrumbs on the crosswalk. Despite this courtesy, Felicia noticed that every traffic light turned green just as Terry reached it, and every congested lane suddenly parted like the Red Sea. It was as if the city unconsciously cooperated with the slow-moving reptile, creating a subtle dance of convenience. Felicia found herself giggling at the absurdity, and Bernard kept squinting at his phone screen in disbelief. His arrival time estimate never changed, stubbornly fixed on time. They reached Pinewood Park before lunch. Felicia hopped off, feeling as though she'd spent an entire day at a spa. She'd read several chapters of her book, admired the city's architecture at a leisurely pace, and even shared a moment of banter with Bernard about the joys of peanut butter. She paid her fare, gave Terry a grateful pat on the shell, and waved goodbye. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than she'd ever thanked a driver before. Bernard, still on Terry's shell, glanced at Felicia as she walked away. "Wait," he shouted, "aren't you forgetting something?" Felicia turned around, rummaged through her purse. "No," she beamed. "I have everything I need," she said, looking a bit bemused but radiant. In that moment, Bernard realized she'd found a peace that no hurried taxi ride could have given her. With a small knock on the shell indicating readiness, Bernard urged Terry onward. They had to climb a rather steep hill to reach Daffodil Tower. By tradition, though none could quite say why, the tower's parking area was positioned at the top of the city's most notorious incline. Motorists dreaded the journey, but Terry simply forged ahead, one measured step at a time. In the swirling chaos of the city streets, glimpses of comedic mishaps flashed by. A haughty mother swathed in fur scarves was so busy complaining on her phone that she failed to see that the taxi she was about to hail was, in fact, a giant turtle. When she finally noticed, she nearly dropped her bejeweled handbag in disbelief. "I can't be seen riding a turtle," she declared, outraged but oddly fascinated. Another young couple, starry-eyed on their honeymoon, laughed and hopped aboard for the pure thrill of it, squealing with delight at how precarious and fun it felt to ride on a living carnival ride. Indeed, a snapshot captured them throwing their arms in the air as if doing so could make them go faster. Bernard's jaw dropped as the clock approached 10:55 AMS, and Terry was steadily chugging up the final stretch of that monstrous hill. In anticipation of getting stuck, Bernard had arranged for a coworker to cover for him in case he arrived late. Yet, despite the seemingly endless climb, they arrived at the entrance of Daffodil Tower with a couple of minutes to spare. Wide-eyed, Bernard hopped off, shaking his head. I don't know how you do it," he admitted, punching a few buttons on his phone to confirm that yes, the time was exactly as it seemed. "It's not about how," Terry said kindly. "It's about believing that it's possible." Bernard chuckled, gave the turtle a friendly pat, and jogged inside the building for his meeting, feeling strangely invigorated. With his shell momentarily emptied, Terry contentedly continued along the street, letting the sunshine crest over him. He took a moment to admire a flower stall on the corner where bumblebees fluttered around daisies and peonies. A cluster of street musicians was warming up nearby, their violin and saxophone offering a patchwork of melodies that drifted through the early afternoon air. Children stared in wide-eyed wonder as he passed, often asking their parents if they could ride the big turtle taxi. Some of the parents, remembering a ride from months or years ago, would nod and smile, though perhaps not on a busy school morning. Across from the bustling farmers market stood a grand hotel, the Regal Shell Inn, which ironically happened to share half of Terry's name. A doorman sporting a top hat, who was well acquainted with Terry, greeted him with cordial familiarity. "Any pickups today, Mr. Tuttleton?" the doorman inquired, tipping his hat. Terry nodded. "I believe there's a Mr. and Mrs. Farnsworth waiting for me. They reserved me weeks in advance. I suppose that's one advantage to traveling with me. You have to plan ahead, so it's not for last-minute folks." The doorman grinned and disappeared into the lobby, soon re-emerging with an elderly couple, wearing enormous sunglasses and matching pastel button-down shirts. The Farnsworths were celebrating their golden anniversary by engaging in a series of unusual activities, determined to keep life interesting after 50 years of marriage. "Oh dear, look at him," cooed Mrs. Farnsworth, adjusting her sunglasses on her wrinkled nose. "Isn't he magnificent?" Mr. Farnsworth nodded enthusiastically, pulling out a camera from his belt pouch. Although Mrs. Farnsworth had sprained her ankle a month before, she managed to gently climb onto Terry's shell seat thanks to the doorman's help and a conveniently installed footstool. Mr. Farnsworth joined her, carefully positioning himself beside her. They looked like two cheerful tourists on a lazy safari. Their destination was the City Overlook Promenade, a lovely spot perched at the edge of a scenic cliff that gave the best view of the skyline. The Farnsworths were hoping to get there by sunset, though they'd chosen to leave in the early afternoon to relish the journey in full. They settled in, excited for a leisurely ride. Terry pulled away from the hotel with methodical slowness, weaving around startled pedestrians who hurried aside but couldn't resist snapping a photo or two. If there was one thing that made for a conversation-starting snapshot, it was a giant turtle taxi meandering down the thoroughfare. The Farnsworths were an eager audience for Terry's stories. He told them about the time he'd transported an entire brass quartet who ended up performing a mini concert on his shell while crawling past the city's poshiest cafe. He mentioned an out-of-town film star who, exasperated by paparazzi swarms, chose the turtle taxi specifically because it would be so unexpected nobody would think to look for him there. More surprising still, the star arrived early to his audition, explaining how improbable it was that he had outrun the paparazzi by traveling at a turtle's pace. The Farnsworths listened, enthralled, and shared tidbits of their own lives, anecdotes about raising their children, traveling the world, and discovering that sometimes the best adventures are the ones you never rush. Halfway through the journey, they paused to admire an impromptu carnival that had sprouted in an empty lot. Children were riding small mechanical ponies, clowns were handing out balloons shaped like giraffes, and a fire breather was attracting a rowdy crowd. Mrs. Farnsworth convinced Terry to edge closer so they could catch a glimpse of a tightrope walker balancing precariously atop a cable stretched between two tent poles. Their vantage point, from Terry's shell, offered a view above the heads of the crowd. The Farnsworths clapped enthusiastically when the tightrope walker completed her final flourish. When they eventually started moving again, they noticed the sky beginning to shift toward a warm, golden hue. By the time they reached the city overlook promenade, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of pink and orange. Terry found a comfortable spot near the railing where the Farnsworths could dismount and enjoy the spectacle. Clutching each other's hands, they watched the sun sink behind the glimmering skyscrapers below, the city lights flickering to life one by one. It was a moment of pure magic, and they thanked Terry with tearful smiles. "We'll never forget this," said Mrs. Farnsworth, voice quavering. "This day has been so special." They insisted on a photograph with their beloved chauffeur, nestling themselves against his shell and grinning like schoolchildren. A passing jogger snapped a few photos, shaking his head at the bizarre but beautiful scene. Not long after the Farnsworths left, satisfied and glowing, Terry felt a rumbling in his own belly. The day had been long, and he was ready for his usual dinner break of lettuce wraps and dandelion salad, but he noticed one more figure lingering nearby, a young girl in a pink coat clutching a box of pastries. She seemed torn between curiosity and timidity. Mr. Turtle?" she called softly, hugging the pastry box. Terry turned and regarded her with kindly interest. She approached, small steps scraping against the sidewalk. "My mom is in the hospital across town," the girl said, barely more than a whisper, "and I was bringing her these cakes." A tear slid down her cheek. "I'm supposed to get there before visitor hours end, but I missed the bus." Her voice trembled with the fear that she might let down her mother, who had been craving a simple treat after her surgery. In that moment, Terry felt an almost paternal warmth. He lowered his head slightly. "Climb on," he said, anticipating the question she was about to ask. She hesitated, but then tiptoed close and gently set her pastries on the seat, carefully climbing up. Terry could feel how light she was, a feather compared to the Farnsworths. He lowered his shell so she wouldn't stumble, then loped into the night at his measured, steady pace, occasionally illuminated by streetlights and passing cars. Some drivers honked in greeting or confusion, but Terry shrugged it off with a slow blink, continuing his purposeful journey. The hospital was at least 8 blocks away, and the clock read 7:05 p.m. Visitor hours ended at 8:00 p.m. The girl, whose name was Shannon, gripped the box of pastries as though her life depended on it. She whispered the details of her mom's illness and how strongly she believed a homemade cake could lift her spirits. Terry listened quietly, offering the occasional rumbling reassurance. Despite the creeping worry that they might not make it in time, Shannon found an odd comfort in the turtle's methodical approach. The city at dusk was a different creature altogether. Neon signs flickered and bars set out chalkboard invitations for happy hour. Food carts sold roasted chestnuts, lines forming around them, the warm smell drifting across the sidewalk. Terry navigated carefully, turning corners with the practiced grace of a dancer in slow motion. Shannon checked her watch nervously as they proceeded. Cars and buses whooshed by, perhaps covering the distance much faster, but even as the clock edged closer to 7:45 p.m., they still had a few blocks to go. Shannon bit her lip, tears threatening again. She couldn't fathom missing this chance. Then, in a mysterious twist that had become Terry's hallmark, every pedestrian crossing light blinked in perfect synchronization for them. Congested traffic seemed to melt away. A grumpy policeman who was about to wave them off recognized Terry and instead halted the other vehicles, giving the giant turtle a friendly tip of the cap. Step by step, they advanced until the bright, sterile lights of the hospital towered ahead. Terry ambled right up to the main entrance, where Shannon slipped off his shell, pastry box in hand, as the clock turned 7:59 p.m. She bowed her head in gratitude, words caught in her throat. "Thank you," she managed at last, her eyes brimming. "You have no idea how much this means. I might not have been able to see my mom today if you hadn't given me a ride." With a gentle pat to his leathery cheek, though she had to stand on tiptoe, she dashed through the sliding doors. Feeling a deep well of satisfaction, Terry decided it was time to clock out. With the press of a button on his shell, he switched a sign from available to off duty. The city sparkled under a blanket of stars. It was always a pleasant stroll back to his personal resting spot near the pond behind City Hall, a peaceful sanctuary of trickling water and soft grass, a place he'd come to call home. Night had fully settled by the time he arrived. The sound of crickets replaced the daytime chorus of horns and chaff. Slowly, carefully, Terry retracted his limbs slightly, though he didn't go fully into his shell. He liked to keep his head out, glancing up at the constellations overhead. After a day of shepherding frantic city dwellers, it felt good to let the hush of the evening air wash over him. As he relaxed, he thought of the day's passengers, Felicia, calmer than she'd been in weeks. Bernard, astonished by his timely arrival, the Farnsworths, adding a once-in-a-lifetime memory to their golden anniversary, and little Shannon, who would hopefully deliver her pastries in the nick of time. He often wondered how long he could continue offering the slow and steady taxi service. Turtles by nature lived quite long lives, and his innate sense of caring for people sustained him in a way that felt both mystical and natural. Maybe, just maybe, he'd keep doing this forever, or at least until the city no longer needed his special brand of calm in the storm. A passing security guard shined a flashlight through the park, his beam briefly catching the reflective squares on Terry's shell. The guard, recognizing the silhouette, waved a friendly hello. Terry blinked lazily in reply, still half lost in reverie. He reflected on how each day brought a new story, some comedic, some touching, and some absolutely bizarre. There was the time he had 8 clowns on his shell, each in polka-dotted costumes. The group headed to a children's party from across town. They had spilled out one by one at the designated stop, each squeaking a bright red nose in farewell. There was a particularly hair-raising moment when an impatient passenger typed a negative review on his phone mid-ride, only to discover upon arrival that he'd actually reached his destination earlier than planned. That passenger ended up apologizing profusely, promising to correct the review in full. But for every tale of impatience or frustration, there were at least a dozen heartfelt expressions of thanks. Somehow, in a city consumed by speed, the giant turtle taxi provided an antidote. People rediscovered the simple joy of existing in the present moment, noticing the color of the sky, the texture of old buildings, the laughter of children on the sidewalk. They found themselves sharing stories with perfect strangers, forging connections that might never have formed in the anonymity of a rushing crowd. The turtle's slow beat created a stillness that let the city's beauty shine through. As Terry closed his eyes for the night, the comedic scenes of the day blended into a soft lullaby. He pictured Felicia opening her novel by the park, reading page after page in peaceful contentment. He imagined Bernard telling colleagues about his curious turtle ride. He envisioned the Farnsworths standing arm in arm, framing the sunset with their fingertips while perched at the overlook. And he pictured little Shannon hugging her mother with joy as the clock's minute hand passed the hour, allowed only by that perfect timing. Tomorrow would bring more riders, some enthusiastic, some skeptical, and some simply in need of a gentle reminder that life didn't have to be lived at breakneck speed. And Terry, the unwavering giant turtle taxi, would be there, creeping steadily along the streets, offering a seat atop his shell and delivering them exactly when they needed to arrive. With that last comforting thought, he tucked his head just slightly further into his shell, letting the city's lullabies serenade him to dreamland, ready to wake again at dawn and do it all once more.